Chickens need dairy, and dairy needs chickens. You know, in your commercial model, chickens are either drumsticks or eggs. You're going to feed them for a short period of time, 6 weeks, and you butcher if it's a broiler, and all it's eating is corn and soy. Or if it's a layer, typically in the commercial model, it's going to make it through one laying season, maybe part of another one, and then it goes to Campbell's. We keep chickens for more than just eggs and drumsticks. Chickens are the cleanup crew on a farm. When I mentioned earlier to picture your kitchen floor if you couldn't sweep it for a month, right? Everything that fell just stayed there. Chickens are what prevents that happening on the farm. And a whole lot more stuff lands on the ground on a farm than lands on the ground in your kitchen. So chickens' number one job is that they're your cleanup crew. And if you take them off, pretty soon you're going to know you have a problem, because every piece of grain that falls is going to be bringing in rodents. All the manure is going to sit right where it got dropped. Mulch dairy, for example, where that compost would tend to settle and compact, and now air can't get in there, so we have anaerobic breakdown, which is slower. Chickens are there to stir it up, get air in there, start the breakdown happening faster. Chickens have a bunch of jobs on the farm. One big job that they do really well is they convert things like leaves and bugs and grass seed into high nitrogen fertilizer. And if you move them where you want them, they'll apply it right where you want. They're pest and parasite control. I don't know about your chickens, but mine will catch a mouse and eat it. They eat lots of different bugs. They scratch open manure piles and eat parasites and parasite eggs. And because they are small and lightweight, they are easy to pen. Because they're climate hardy, they can also free range and still put themselves to bed at night. They will home in and go where you want them to be shut up at night once they're trained to that. It doesn't take very long. So these are really powerful cleanup and nitrogen application animal that's very easy for your farm to absorb the impact of. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we use birds before I go to what we feed them. One of the things a gallon of milk is all the high quality protein that 100 chickens needs for a day. Since you don't need 100 chickens on a little bitty acreage, I usually translate that to a quart of milk is a high quality protein for a dozen large or 2 dozen small laying hens. So picture if you have 2 dozen brown leghorns out there, that's a quart of milk a day on top of the scratch or whatever you're giving them to provide their high quality protein, so they have enough protein in them to make feathers and eggs for you, right? You want a bird that's warm, well covered, and making eggs, and that's a lot of protein. A quart of milk will do that. If you're running buff Brahmas, think a quart of milk is about a dozen buff Brahmas. We apply chicken impact all over the farm in the places where it's most useful. On the pasture to spread cow pies, in the barn and the pig pen to clean up spilled grains and to stir up litter that's got manure in it so that that'll decompose. We apply chickens to the gardens all the time. I hate chickens that get loose in my garden. The one time my kids hark back to as Mama lost it was about the third time a bunch of chickens got into my big garden that I had fenced and fenced and fenced again, and they ripped out 3 beds of stuff that I had just planted, and I carried on like a 2-year-old, right? I hate chickens loose in my garden, but I love chickens applied to my garden with careful impact, and we're going to talk about how we do that. If you've got nothing else to do with chickens, put them in a chicken house next to the compost bin, fence the whole thing, throw your compost in, they'll keep it stirred, they'll manure it, and your compost will get aerated. You'll lose a few earthworms, but your compost will break down faster. They'll do a good job, and they'll get a lot of their living off that compost pile. We do typically buy our birds, don't raise them. We're working on that. We have breeding stock for silver appleyard ducks and buckeye chickens, and I would like to raise our own birds, which the farm ought to be capable of. Genetically modified feed had a real impact on the breedability of American livestock. Our son, who's in vet school, informed us recently that dairymen are starting to agitate about GMOs in their feed because the organic guy across the way, who's not really doing anything different except for his feed isn't genetically modified, is not having the breed back issue that your conventional dairyman is having. Europe, Asia, New Zealand, Australia, they already knew that GMOs were going to create reproductivity issues, and we weren't listening. and now we're having to pay attention. So because birds tend to be high grain fed, even organic birds, and because there can be cross-pollination issues with genetically modified crops being next to non-genetically modified, what does a repro issue in a chicken look like? It looks like no eggs, right? So we're working hard toward the goal of raising our own birds. But in the meantime, we used to order them from the commercial hatchery, in whatever size batch we needed, whether it was laying hens or meat birds. And something we're finding that our local Rural King Tractor Supply, Rural King is especially good. They keep birds in tanks almost the whole year. And the funny thing about baby chicks is that when they're newborns and you don't know if they're going to live, they're worth $250 or $350 a piece. And when they're 3 weeks old and they're starting to grow feathers and they're not so cute, they're down to $1 or 75 cents or 50 cents. So we said, okay, Rural King, if you want to raise out our broilers and our new laying flock for 3 weeks, put 3 weeks of care and feed into them, and then give them to us at a markdown, I don't know that we can turn that one down.
And the bad ones have died.
And all the ones that were going to die are dead now. So we're sharing our trade secret here, that's a great way
That
to
should not go out on the video.
Yeah.
2 weeks, 3 weeks when you buy them?
Well, we're waiting for the price to go down.
Yeah, right.
So they're
That's
starting at
generally 2 to 3 weeks.
Yes, right.
And then it goes, is diminishing returns at 2?
No. The only difference is somebody else has bought them after that. I want to catch them when they're as low as they're going to go, but before my neighbor gets them.
So we bought ours from a local guy in Weaverville, and same thing. He kept them longer and fed them, and we paid less for them.
Right. Because they're not so cute.
I have a question. I don't understand something. My grandfather's farm had many chickens. There were no fences except to keep them out of the garden and the house.
Right.
And then every night they went into their little house and
Right.
that was fine. So why doesn't that work?
It does. We do it.
We do it, and the area around where their chicken house is completely bare.
But I don't care. I keep 4 flocks of chickens. One of them is doing that. And it cleans my pasture, it patrols the yard, and the only 2 places I don't want it are in my garden and on my front porch.
They go in the barn. We know.
Ours go in the barn.
Well, we got doors to keep them from roosting over the hay or whatever. They can get in and stir up the litter in the pig pen, and where the sheep are right now at night, because it's lambing time, but they patrol the farm. The other chickens are in tractors or behind netting because I want to apply their impact in a very specific place. I'm not penning them because I don't want them to free range, but because those particular birds can do me so much good in a specific place on the farm. Young chicks will come on our place. If they're already 3 weeks old, they go straight to a tractor on grass. Until they're 6 weeks old, they're going to be on organic crumbles. Then we're going to transition them over to local grains that have been soaked. One of the big secrets that, people know about feeding fermented things or sprouted things, right? But when we went and looked at our, sources from the 1800s about animal feeds, we discovered that the only reason we don't still feed soaked feeds all the time is that it doesn't adapt itself well to an economy of scale. If I'm trying to feed 200 hogs, fermenting cut up roots before I give them to them. Anybody know what kvass is? Fermented drink? Okay, prior to industrial agriculture, animal feeds were, if it was convenient and if the temperatures allowed, soaked before they were fed to increase palatability, to increase nutrient availability, and to increase probiotics, right? It was common.
But you also wouldn't soak crumbles.
No, you'd never soak crumbles because you just get mush. But I mean, you could wet them before you feed them, but you wouldn't soak them for 3 to 5 days. Whereas we started feeding when what we were trying to do was find a feed that we could feed on the farm to poultry that wasn't going to diminish their reproductive ability. So we started buying local grains that we knew had to be non-GM because there aren't any GMs of that. So oats, barley, there is some GM wheat, but not in our area. Oats, barley, wheat. If I've got one guy who raises heritage corn that's a long way from any other corn, so I can buy corn from him when he has it. Millet, sunflower seeds. We'll soak those, and that's the diet plus milk, a little bit of kelp and a little bit of salt, Okay, so here's what our chickens eat. Fermented grain mixed with salt and kelp. For those who want to know amounts, that's at about the rate of 1/4 pound per bird per day or a little bit less. That's standard chicken feeding, but my chicken feed has a lot of holes in it. So the actual amount of nutrition is a little bit, by weight, is a little bit lower. They eat forage, grass and insects. They get raw milk products every day. If I've got bakery waste around, I can make that easier for the chickens to eat by throwing a little bit of bakery waste in, letting it soak it up. It's easier to eat whey if it's bread soaked in whey than if it's just whey in the trough. And then they generally get meat scraps a couple of times a week. Usually what that means is that when we're done butchering a cow or a pig, we take all the parts that we don't want to eat, grind them up, and either freeze them in a lump about the size of my fist, bag them, keep in the freezer, or better yet, if I have the time, I'll stuff them in quart jars and can it all up. Mark it very carefully, not for human consumption, because there are parts we don't want to eat in there. It looks just like what I can for us. And then feed that out at the rate of like a quart will last easily a week for the 3 dozen birds that I'm feeding that to. Right, but that's along with milk. Carrion, if we find a dead animal on the road and it's convenient, we toss it in the chicken pen, they'll eat it, right. Chickens are omnivores. They want plants and they want animal protein.
Would the pigs go for the roadkill, the fresh roadkill?
They would, but in general, I'm trying to feed my pigs stuff they don't recognize as fresh meat because I'm fresh meat. And my 10-year-old who feeds them is fresh meat. And I don't want them to think about that. Our laying hens will typically lay for us for about 3 to 5 years. They will average a much slower rate of lay than a commercial bird. A commercial bird's expected to produce 3 to 330 eggs in the year after 1 year of laying, she soup. My birds typically produce closer to 200 eggs a year, which in 1940 was considered dang good laying. But they'll last me for 3, 4, 5 years, and they'll be giving me services all of those 3, 4, 5 years, right? And they'll do it on home-raised or at least home-processed feeds. I am buying most of my grains locally. I have raised them. It's a lot of work. And right now, because any land you or I am farming is nutrient depleted from having stuff shipped off of it for the last 60 years, importing nutrients when you can is just a good idea. You know, buying in hay, if that guy wants to sell me his carbon and minerals so that I can put them on my land needs them right now, so I'm going to do it. Same with my grain. At the end of a 3 to 5 years serviceable life giving me eggs, my chickens will get canned. It's the tastiest meat on the farm. If I can, it's also going to be tender enough. And I'll cook down the bones for broth. And at the very last, those cooked bones will go in the pig pen, and the pigs will think that's like the greatest thing going. So every bit of that chicken is utilized. It's staying on my farm for the greatest number of revolutions of the energy that's going into it.
So first of all, we do, as we mentioned, have a stationary chicken house that we use, and those free range, and that's at our home place. And then we have some movable coops. So this is one that my son built. It's really neat because you can get the eggs from the outside. The chickens can put themselves away.
The feeder and the water hang off the bottom.
Yeah, there was a time when we just took that out, and as I mentioned before, without that fence around it, we were finding predators getting them, and then they weren't always going back at night as well, because they would go find other places to roost. But now with the electric netting around them, they always go back in. And then what we do is we'll put this house in one location, and then we'll run the fence out in a loop, and then we'll keep moving that so that they're getting different grass and loop differently. And then once we've done all those loops, then we'll move the chicken house again, because it does take a tractor to move that chicken house. But that's worked out real well for us. This one can follow the cows if we want it to follow the cows, or do whatever we want. We've been doing a lot with it in the garden now, so that the chickens are preparing the garden for next year.
Chickens, if they're left in one place for long enough, they'll turn the top surface of the soil into concrete. But if you've mulched it well, they'll just keep that mulch stirred up, and the ground stays soft underneath. So right now where they are, that's actually a bed that was planted to clover a year ago, and it's been growing as a green manure. It's a 10th acre garden bed. That fence doesn't quite encircle a 10th of an acre. I'm putting them there because I'm going to plow that. I'm going to till that in the spring.
So we got different chicken tractors that we've used. We used all kinds. So this is simply stock panels that are leaning against each other. One of the advantages for us is that our land has got a lot of rough places. So this can kind of follow some of that. We still have to put things where there might be some holes or something like that. But they do real well. This one is okay to move. It's a little bit, because it's 2 stock panels. You have to have somebody at each end, and you kind of drag it along. Again, we're trying to move them as often as that grass gets eaten out so that they're getting new stuff all the time. This one was very easy to build. Just use zip ties to hold stuff together, and when we had to build the triangle wood at the end.
Even the triangle at the end is held in by zip ties. So at the end of the season, when we're not using these, we just cut the zip ties, fold the thing up, put it against the barn wall.
What's their access to roosting while they're in that hog pen?
If I have it, I'll use like a stick of sassafras because it doesn't, parasites like lice don't like sassafras. Just shove it through the wire and they'll perch on it.
And they drop eggs where?
Well, when we had little kids, the little kids would crawl in there and get them. We'll put a, I think you'll see a picture of milk crates with with one end half closed, and they'll usually lay in there.
Yeah, but that's the problem with this one, is somebody has to be quite small to be able to get in there.
Stuff the children in.
So this one, however, this one's online. You may have seen it.
John Suskovich is an online guy. Anyway, this is his design, and that's his picture.
And we really like these. They've got wheels on the back so that they're easy to move. Again, now they've got a stiff board on the bottom, so once again we've got a little bit of problems with contour that chickens can get out from underneath them. But it's a good model. We like the tarp on them, and then we hang the bell waterers on the inside so that
A note about these 2 kinds of tractors and that coop with the netting. I've got 2 of these and the coop with the netting on my gardens right now, using it to apply chicken impact to gardens where I want it. The 2 of these that I have out there, we've had, it's been -10 in our neck of the woods not that long ago. They're completely covered with sheet plastic stapled on. One end is a little bit open. And then over that, because we get some pretty high winds, I've stapled on deer netting. I haven't had any trouble having the plastic blow off, which I did the winter before. Interesting to note, not only am I getting really concentrated impact, meaning all of those gardens are mulched, the mulch is getting stirred and manure is being added to it, right? So I'm laying down manure in a place where there's carbon to absorb it on my garden where I want it. Not only that, the chickens that have laid the best for me every year for the last 3 years are the chickens that are in a tractor that is covered with plastic. No matter how cold, I think I had 2 weeks this year maybe where I didn't see an egg at all. Their feed efficiency has gone up. It's counterintuitive because I got 12 birds in 60 square feet in one of these tractors, way above industry standards, but 5 feet per bird when they're on the ground. So you would think that the guys inside the big fence, I have a lot of room, they're better off. Tain't so. Because that tractor is being moved up every single day, those birds get fresh greens from underneath the mulch, fresh bugs, because once that plastic's parked over it, the ground thaws, and just a fresh bed every single day. And their feed efficiency is noticeably higher. They eat less and use it better, and they've laid eggs for me all winter. I'm really in love with plastic-covered tractors on my garden in the wintertime. It's a win-win-win situation. Laying down nitrogen, stirring up the mulch, and eating weeds, and laying me eggs all at the same time.
The last way that we have done chickens is in our low tunnels or our high tunnels. So those are in the garden, so that when we're finished with whatever we're growing there for the winter or the fall, then we would turn the chickens loose in there and let them tear that up.
You can see there was like kale and root crops in here, and they're eating and tearing
Now,
out.
any time that we are finished with a tunnel, with what we're doing, we're planting again, because we're keeping these gardens going all year round. We're not putting the chickens in there as much, because we're using those tunnels.
The place we haven't touched on, we've hit our cow, pig, chicken triad and how milk's going to feed all of them. Believe it or not, milk feeds your garden. I don't mean milk-fed pumpkins because I don't care. I mean, all the different ways that milk and milk products are actually playing a significant role in our garden. This is true of milk, it's even truer of whey because the bacterial activity in whey is very high. And you're going to generate a lot of whey, and your pigs will be happy to consume it all for you, but divert some of it and put it in the garden. Diluted, I would say about 1 to 10. It is a terrific foliar feed or side dressing. No stronger than 1 to 10. You start doing funny things maybe to the pH of the leaf surface. But 1 to 10, foliar feed and a side dressing. If you can do that several times in the summer, you will see a difference. You're applying minerals, nitrogen, and probiotics all at the same time. As an antifungal spray, I don't know if it was a dairy maid who was pampering her favorite rose bush by taking the wash water out of the dairy and dumping it on it that discovered this. But you can go look this up even at science-based, commercial sites. A less than 10% solution of milk, so 9 parts water, 1 part milk, or a little bit less strong, is as good an antifungal as anything the chemist can provide you with. How's that for interesting? I'm not telling you it'll take care of your septoria leaf spot on your tomatoes because I think that stuff was spawned in hell and I'm not sure what we're going to do about it. But if you start doing it early enough in the year, I bet it gives you an edge. And I know for other plants, like, you're getting mildew on your cucumbers or in your zucchini, a less than 10% solution of milk sprayed on upper side and lower side of the leaves is a real help. This is raw milk. You know what, though? I don't think it has to be because the science guys who admit it aren't referring to raw milk. They're saying go to the store and buy a gallon. So milk. As a compost heater, whey is wonderful. As I get older, it gets a little harder for me to go turn 2 or 3 tons of compost. It's just like an interesting thing to do with a stray hour. But punching holes in it with a spud bar and then pouring whey on it goes a long way toward helping it to heat up again. Jeevamrutha. It's an Indian word. I don't know it. Oh, it means water of life or something. My husband inelegantly calls it poo brew, right? This is our garden superfood. So we have a 55-gallon barrel on the uphill side, of course, of our main garden. No, both of our gardens, we have one of these. And it's plumbed with an exit pipe at the bottom so I can take a hose off of it. And we'll fill it most of the way with water. Everybody needs a number, right? But don't be slavishly worrying about these numbers. The original recipe for this goes 2 parts of manure, 1 part of urine. Some of your highest quality soil. That's because your highest quality soil is going to have your best microbial life in it. And then the original recipe that I looked at was then you're adding some raw sugar and some bean flour, right? Well, I didn't want to add raw sugar and bean flour because I have to pay for those. But the raw sugar is sugar and bean flour is protein and carbs, and that's what's in my whey. And my whey is already probiotic. So I add whey to that mixture, and then I aerate it by stirring once a day for a week. The warning that you see whenever you find a site that knows what Jeevamrutha is keep it covered, it smells terrible. It does smell pretty strong. But at the end of that time, you can take, so if I've got a 55-gallon barrel and I've added all that to it, it's dilute enough, but it's strong enough that I can either feed my plants directly or I can foliar feed them. I'll just run the hose out. The one difficulty I have is that if I haven't been careful what I've added, I've got enough coarse stuff in there that'll plug up my hose sometimes and I have to ream it out. But if I've been careful that my poo didn't have too much straw in it, I can then stir it up real good, run my hose out into the garden, and I will use this especially because we have a problem with squash bugs and squash vine borers. I will use this as a boost right when my squash plants are getting to the spread state. You know how vining squash will grow right here for the first couple of months, and then about June it'll start shooting out its arms, right? At that point, right before that point, and then from that point on, I try and get out and give my squash plants poo brew about every 2 weeks. Once every 2 weeks, I meant not twice 2 weeks, but every 2 weeks, about twice a month, I'll put poo brew on them. I'll put it at the point, at their root crown, but then I'll put it out along all the vines. The result is that I have, in years when I've had really bad squash bug infestations in other places, anywhere I've done this, the survival rate is much higher, and if they get wilt, the recovery rate is better. Although if they get wilt bad enough, they're going to die for me. That's just, I don't know what you do about that.
Can you use human urine instead of dairy urine?
There's always a question. I don't. We put that on the garden. If it's a fallow bed, or more likely we're going to put it in a compost bin. But the only human urine that makes it directly on the garden is whatever anybody had to do in a bucket in the barn, right? They're milking the cows, and the bathroom's a long way off. But for human manure, we would use a bucket system, sawdust in a bucket, and then we'd compost it for a year and then spread it on the pasture. And we're not good at that yet because I have like 2/3 rebellion in the ranks about bucket toilets, so some of us use it and some of us don't, but I love it.
What's the origin of this again? The history of the...
Of the poo brew. I don't know how I ran into it. That word is either Hindi or Urdu, maybe both, I don't know. There's some great, interesting, sustainable farming going on in India where the Green Revolution, as in chemical farming, hit delayed. It invaded an intact native farming system that was on the small scale and worked really well, and it has created disaster. And so they are very conscious of their own fight to retain their indigenous populations, their indigenous methods, and to show that they can do this without being invaded by Western agriculture. And I found this on several sites and then adapted it for my use. But I love it. I use it on tomatoes for the same purpose. And I'd use it anywhere, only I can't make more than I need. The only thing I wouldn't apply it to is a leaf crop that I'm going to consume in the next 3 weeks. I'm not going to put it on top.
So are you keeping this in a container? And
It's in a 55-gallon barrel, and I stir it just with a stick or a shovel.
keep for how long?
Well, I'll make it, I'll aerate it for a week, and then I might be using it for a week.
It stays out there a long time.
But I could process it. Right, if I forget about it, it's still there. I just think,
Keep the lid on, though.
And you don't dilute it with water when you apply it?
no. I could, but I don't. It's just coming straight out. But it's 55 gallons of water
Yeah, it's
with
already
this stuff in there.
diluted
So
way down.
it doesn't look dilute. It's pretty dark green and pretty stinky, but it's not too strong for what I'm putting it on.
So this is plus the water.
All of this in 55 gallons of water, sorry. Fill the barrel with water and throw all this stuff in and stir it up.
So if you've used half of it, you just go back and put half in?
No, I'll use it all up and then start over.
Okay.
I'll just, if I've got more in there than I need, I'll empty it. I'll put it anywhere on the garden and then start again.
You said you aerated, is that just by stirring it? Or?
I think it says stir for 1 minute. I don't have a minute. I'll stir it, till it looks like it's really moving, and then I'll quit. The animal foods we raise in the garden is going to be a little bit of a step back to how do we garden at all? When we plant a garden, we're saying not only what will I eat and what grows in my area, right? But we're asking also what can I store and how much of this crop do I need? Now, most or all of you already know that if I need 90 quarts of tomatoes put up at the end of this year, I plant tomatoes thinking 160 quarts because I don't know if my tomatoes are going to do well this year. Say I need 1,000 pounds of potatoes to get through the year, but I don't know how my potatoes are going to do. I'm probably going to put in half that in sweet potatoes and some corn to back that up too, because our family buys very little food. I don't like buying food, and I don't like bought food. I don't like to eat it. So I'm trying to grow what we need. Growing what you need means growing a surplus always. You don't know what's going to make. It also means growing a backup crop, because sometimes a crop fails completely. That has been the fact as long as humans have known how to put in a garden, right? Or to raise a grain crop. That you garden, you raise crops with a surplus in mind and a backup crop to that crop. What happens to all that food, all that extra food that almost inevitably happens? That's where pigs come in. That's why the good Lord invented pigs, because before refrigeration, the best, and even after refrigeration, the best way you have of storing surplus perishable nutrients is to put them on 4 feet and let them reproduce. And that's pigs eat what we eat, but they eat the parts and the conditions that we can't or won't eat. So they can convert. They are the perfect animal to follow behind a human being, even to the point where they eat our manure and benefit from it, but I'm not suggesting you try that. Pigs are oriented to humans. They love what we eat, and they love to clean up behind us. So when we're making those decisions, and I'm not going to touch on raising food for us, because I'm going to assume that you guys all garden too. There are lots of good sources who will give you way more detail than we have time for in how to garden for people. I'm going to reference what do we raise for animals. Because the big expense for the small-scale farmer, where does the weekly or monthly check go out when we start raising animals? It goes to the feed store. How do we get around that? Things that we raise for animals on our farm: small grains and corn, roots, turnips, rutabagas, beets, mangels, legumes, clover, or more likely beans, and greens, things like cabbage and kale. The big emphasis on our farm in our climate is we grow a fair amount of corn. We're not talking an acre, we're talking 1/10 of an acre, and that's for us as well as for the pigs. And we grow a lot of roots for winter feeding. My favorite is the Mangels. Everybody familiar with that one? Mangels, isn't that a great word? Like, it has a hyphen in the middle, Mangels. M-A-N-G-E-L. I think I have it on a slide somewhere. Hyphen W-U-R-Z-E-L. It's this great old Germanic word, and all it means is a great big sweet sugar beet. It's red on the outside, white on the inside. In Australia, they call them silver beets, and they eat them. I find them rather boring. They're not as tasty as a table beet, but they will get really big. Sources will tell you 20 pounds. What you'll really see is closer to 10, but you can grow an awful lot of biomass in a small space with Mangels. Plant them after your chances of frost are pretty much gone. They don't have to be completely gone, but they are frost sensitive. Plant them in the spring. Keep it cultivated while they're growing until they're big enough to shade the space between the rows. And if you get a long dry spell and you've got rainwater, they'll benefit by being kept a little bit moist, but they send down a long taproot, and they produce, on 1/10 of an acre, we've raised 3,000 pounds of Mangels. We pull them in the fall before it's going to freeze, top them, feed the tops to the pigs if they haven't already dried down until they're not worth anything. Bag them in feed sacks, haul them home, put them in the root cellar. They keep beautifully. We do not have any kind of a rot problem. The one thing that they'll tell you about Mangels is that they start out, I don't know what it is about them, but if you feed them straight out of the ground, they're supposed, like in November, they're supposed to cause scours. So the old wisdom was you don't start feeding Mangels till after Christmas, right? Now, I have fed Mangels for Christmas and not seen scours, but I just passed that on to you for what it's worth. But after that, if my hogs are getting hay, Mangels, and dairy waste, I'm going to throw them stuff to vary that, right? But I'm not worried that I'm not feeding them, right? So there's farm fed. If we've raised the hay, great, then it's off the farm. If we haven't, they're taking somebody else's carbon and minerals and turning it into pig and compost for me, so I'm okay with that. So hay, Mangels, and dairy waste of any kind.
Have you had trouble getting your pigs to eat hay? We couldn't get ours to eat it at all.
I would imagine that the ones at Berries might not eat hay.
Right.
Because they've been only on grain fed.
I mean, if you start with a young pig and you're throwing in a flake of hay or a couple of flakes of hay a day to a couple of pigs, right? I would expect that they would start to show some interest in eating that, and they're going to make bedding out of the rest. So when I throw in hay, the first thing my pigs do is eat it, but their bedding pile's getting higher too, so I know they're not eating all of it.
I know you want to talk about feeding livestock, but since you have such a large family and you're not buying food, what are you kitchen gardening?
That's a great question, because 40 years ago when I was gardening, I'd go and look at all the interesting stuff in the seed catalog, and I'd try it. Then I had children, and they were not interested in being creative about what they took in. They have a very short list of things that they will eat reliably. and that's what I grow.
Yeah, I mean,
So
the
it's like
farm should
20
be about
crops.
feeding us, and that means feeding what they're going to eat.
Right.
And us.
And my kids don't like kohlrabi, right? So I don't grow any kohlrabi.
We do a lot of potatoes.
We grow a lot of
Irish.
potatoes, a lot of tomatoes, a good bit of corn, a good bit of cabbages because we're all sauerkraut fans. Winter squash, a lot of winter squash. Summer squash.
Peas.
Did you know, I learned this 2 years ago and it's really great, so I'm passing it on. You take oversized zucchini, take the skin off, everybody skins it, seeds it, grates it, puts it in the fridge and then freezer and then does not make zucchini bread with it. Forget that stuff. So skin it, seed it, cut it into strips, dry it, and then cook it up later in the wintertime, rehydrate it in broth or tomatoes, and maybe throw in a few dumplings. That's how my daughter likes to do it, but it's great just the way it is. So zucchini can be used in other ways than frozen and shredded. It dries really well. So we grow summer squash. We grow a lot of garlic and onions. Okra,
beans.
it doesn't like Ohio very well, but a lot of peas and beans. A lot of greens. It's easier to describe our winter garden because there's fewer crops in it. So in July, we'll plant something like 900 row feet of carrots. I think I got that right. Anyway, 2 30-inch, 30-foot beds, 35-foot beds of carrots, another one of beets, 2 of spinach, maybe another one of like mash and corn salad so that I have a really, really cold hardy salad bed. And then we cover those either with PVC and plastic, so 10-foot PVC over 2 30-inch beds and the 1 foot of, so it's basically 6 feet wide. Cover it, throw plastic over it, sandbag the sides, tie down the ends. If it's pretty well grown by the time we're starting to get frost, I cover it before we get a hard frost, and that'll grow right through most winters. These last 2 winters, we've had some really nasty cold snaps that have done some damage. But like my spinach, which got zapped by a very early hard freeze that set it back, I still have the equivalent of, I have 2 30-foot beds that are maybe a third of each of them got frozen back, but 2 35-foot beds, 30 inches wide each bed of spinach that produced lightly in the coldest seasons because they'd been hit by an early frost. Normally in the winter, I can't keep up with that spinach. It's just tons of spinach. The chickens get spinach. But right now, because it's coming on, I got a whole lot of spinach, and I will right up into June when my spring planted spinach is going to take over. So my winter crops, spinach, another cold hardy green, and then beets and corn. The beets don't survive the winter, carrots. The beets don't survive the winter as well as the carrots do. Keep them covered with plastic. If it's going to get really cold, put row cover under the plastic. So my high tunnels are 6 feet high in the middle and 10 feet wide. So I can get in there and spread row cover on wickets to keep it covered if it's going to get really cold. And if it gets too cold, it's going to freeze some of that back. But it's going to supply us with fresh vegetables all winter long. And that works well for us. Then as those things get spent, I've got a warm climate to start new things in, right? So right now, where the carrots were has been ripped out, and my daughters are trying to experiment. They put a pile of half-finished compost every 2 feet all the way down that 35-foot row, and they dropped a couple of tomato seeds on top of each, because we've always noticed that it's the volunteer tomato plants in the compost bin that do the best. Mm-hmm. So we're hoping to get a jump start by starting them in the high tunnel. They'll start early, be under cover for longer, and maybe we'll be able to take advantage of that. Because the only problem with volunteers is that they're later than the rest of our tomatoes, right? They don't come out until the weather's right, so we're giving them artificial climate. So back to things that we grow for animals. I plant 1/10 of an acre of corn. I like Country Gentleman. Makes big ears, closely spaced kernels on the ear. It's non-GM. It's a nice sweet corn. It's not overly sweet. It's a great table corn. So I'll plant 1/10 of an acre. We and the Sisters of the Convent will harvest everything we want for the table in the freezer. There's still a lot. That's way less than half of the corn. And then we go through. We used to I'd try and grow that out, put it in shocks, pretty little teepees, and save it for winter forage. Only in our neck of the woods, if you're going to plant a grain, there's enough, and it's probably true here, there's enough wildlife habitat around our farm to support as many turkeys and deer as it takes to wipe out about 5 acres of any grain you want to plant. So the first 5 acres you plant are wildlife food. And it's only the 6th, the 7th, the 8th that we would get to harvest. So I stopped trying to raise corn like that, and instead I'll cut that corn when it's a little bit past the milk stage. So once it's not sweet enough for us, but as soon as I see the first sign of coon has figured out where it is, I'll go in there, cut that corn, stack it in the barn, and it'll feed my hogs for about 4 hogs for, say, 6 weeks, maybe a little longer. I'm disadvantaged. I can't use the fact that corn stores well, because for me it won't store well, right? But it's great hog food even at that stage, so I just grow it, harvest it, and feed it to the pigs. In the understory, if I was doing my job right in the spring, I'll have either beans or clover growing to fill in that spot in the garden when I take the corn off. I have raised small grains, so wheat, oats, and barley as animal food. Same problem. Wildlife likes it too. So what I found you can do is wait until it's in the milk stage before it is hard enough to harvest and thresh. Cut it, let it dry like hay, rake it, shove it in the back of the pickup, throw it up in the loft, and feed it down whole, grain in the straw, to poultry and pigs. The poultry will scratch through it and take the grain, and I can throw that straw in, the pigs will eat it. Pigs will eat straw, it just has to be good quality straw. And then what I feed whole to the pigs, like our barn loft has a hole right over the pig pen, right? So I'm just shoving whatever I've got stored up there down that hole to the pigs, and they'll eat grains that were cut green and dried as hay and get the grain value of it too. Do the same thing with beans. I'll plant a bean crop after. None of this entails that I put more land into cultivation than I'm already keeping for human beings. Because as I use a plot for a green manure or a fallow bed, in every case, I can't think of a case when this is not true, what I've planted for green manure or what I've planted as ground cover for a fallow bed is also food for something. If my potatoes, if I have a dry year and my potato vines are dry at the end of July, and it's not too hard to dig them right then, we'll go dig them and we'll plant beans. You can go to the store and buy a bag of dried pintos and put them in. We'll plant beans. I'll put the rows close together and I'll cultivate them once just with a hoe and let the beans cover. If we have a long fall, I'll be able to harvest those plants whole in the fall after they're dry, throw them in the back of the pickup, take them home, put them up in the loft, let the kids play on top of them, thresh out as many mature pinto beans as we want for the family, heap up the rest, haulms, vines, everything, heap up the rest, and shovel it down a bit at a time to the hogs. It's one of their favorite foods, bean vines, with the beans in them or without the beans in them, either way. You see it's doing me this is serving me 3 purposes. It keeps my ground covered after the potatoes are out of the soil. It puts nitrogen in the soil, and it feeds us and the hogs. And the chickens too, although they don't eat as many pinto beans. So I'm looking for ways that the garden we've talked about holding photons on the farm for as many revolutions as you can without straining the thing till it's not elegant anymore. They say physicists can identify a good theory partly by the fact that it is elegant. It just seems right. And when you start doing something that's too much work, look for another path, right? So if it'd be too much work for me to try and hold those photons for every last second they could stay on the farm. All of these are elegant systems that work really well. I mean, you can see the multiple uses of those beans. Ground cover, shade out weeds, put down nitrogen, feed the humans, feed the pigs, feed the chickens. And catch sunlight. Chickens in the garden and cover crops and green manure crops. I'll give you a few examples really fast. But remember, the more cycles anything spends on the farm, the more service I'm getting out of it. Buckwheat is presently my favorite cover crop in the summertime because if you let it mature, they always say if this is your cover crop and you're growing it for a green manure, you're going to cut it the minute it starts to set flowers because it's going to start setting grain right after that, setting seed right after that. Now if it does and you cut it, now you've got a weed problem of buckwheat. Well, I'm willing to deal with that a little bit. I'll grow my buckwheat. When it starts to set seed, I'll start pulling chicken tractors over my buckwheat. So my gardens are 1/10 of an acre big. It's 40 passes over that for my 6x10 chicken tractor to go over that. What happens is every time I move a tractor up, it knocks over these plants. Good year they're this high. Knocks them over and lays down a mulch. So I'm not going to have any bare soil. It feeds my chickens because they're threshing out and eating buckwheat seed. And it plants a new crop of buckwheat, which the minute it rains, after I've moved that forward, that buckwheat's going to start to grow up through the in-place grown mulch. On top of that, if I put my chickens on bare soil and they poop, a lot of my nitrogen is either going to volatilize or wash off. But if I put them on soil that's already got a plant growing on it or that has a mulch on it, now I've got carbon to hang on to my nitrogen. Well, in this case, I got plants growing on it and I got a mulch in place, so I have a good trap for my chicken nitrogen that's going on in the garden. That's another example of ways that without putting more land in tillage, without even really doing any more work, I'm simply putting my chickens in the place where they and my cover crops are going to coexist really well. And they're going to improve my garden to feed me the next season. Like that. Oats and peas grown as a cover are also going to feed my chickens, lay down an in-place mulch, absorb nitrogen, and they've also set nitrogen. Clover will do the same thing for you, and if you move fast enough, that clover will recover very quickly. OSU, the O being Ohio, not Oklahoma, has a bulletin that you can look at that'll give you some idea of the stocking density that they use, how many chickens to how many square feet to how fast of a move, if they want to keep a clover and timothy cover, keep it regrowing, not wiping it out with the chickens, as a cover crop / green manure / chicken food / what's the other thing? Nitrogen trap. We can use beans that way, but they're kind of big for chickens, so I don't use beans that way. No, Ohio, not Oklahoma. I may have said that. I could have said it totally backward, but Ohio. If I plant small grains in the fall and I graze them with my chickens or my sheep over the winter, I not only fertilize them for the spring, but being grazed makes the plant feel threatened, so it sends out more tillers, so I actually end up with a denser stand, more seed heads in the spring. I don't do it very often. So I am describing for you what can happen. I am not telling you I do any of this perfectly, let alone all of it perfectly every year.
What grains are you sowing in the fall for spring harvest that you're...
Usually in Ohio it would be wheat, but I heard somebody a couple of weeks ago say he plants his barley in the fall as well. You can plant oats in the fall, but I think they're going to spring kill. Mine do. Winter kill. Mine do. Those are all examples, too, of what is called folding, or it has a lovely long word, transhumation, which just means that an animal is dropping its manure right where you want it. It's moving nutrients to a place where you want them and dropping them there. I just want to address the question of pigs in gardens. We do use pigs in gardens. We'll use them to clear a space. Our soil is high in clay, which means it pugs quickly. It compacts quickly, and then it holds water. So I applied pigs to one of my beds 2 winters ago, so it's been like 18 months. And it did not grow good squash for me the next year because it was wet the whole blessed summer because the percolation was so bad. I'm hoping that having mulched it really heavily over the winter, what did I do with it last year? In the last fall, I had chickens pastured on it to keep the mulch stirred. I'm hoping that we're sending down enough roots and getting enough earthworm activity in there that I'll have some percolation this year. We will be talking a bit about whole farm composting, and then we'll just talk a little bit about lifestyle before we wrap this up.